she calculated the true gender gap to be probably closer to 31%. That's including all different types of jobs, not just full-time jobs. And more than almost half of women are actually employed in part-time jobs. So they're not even considered in this statistic.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and it's no secret that women have been putting up with men's violence and bullshit, pardon my French, for a long time. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and his government have responded poorly, to say the least, to the allegations of rape from Brittany Higgins.
I was raped inside Parliament House by a colleague, and for so long it felt like the people around me only cared because of where it happened and what it might mean for them.
This is for the benefit of Miss Higgins, Senator. This is
They're
not
off.
for me.
Come on.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, she doesn't feel that way.
She doesn't feel
at all.
Senator Hanson-Young. Senator Gallagher has
That is not her view. That everyone sitting on that side of the table is here for her interests.
Yeah, don't.
Please don't use her.
Do not use her
interest as a shield.
Order.
And the separate allegations against Attorney General Christian Porter, allegations that he denies. The Prime Minister refused to go outside and meet the Women's March for Justice, where there were several members of Australia Institute staff in attendance. And just today, he had a bit of a train wreck press conference, to be frank, where he ended up attacking the media for asking questions about these issues.
You'd be aware, in your own organisation, that there is a person who has had a complaint made against them for harassment of a woman in a women's toilet. All of us who sit in glass houses here start getting into that. What I'm suggesting...
How is it that you did not know about the alleged rape of Brittany Higgins in Lindsay Reynolds' office, and yet you know about some incident that's happened in the media or among journalists, and have now aired that publicly, despite that maybe being against the wishes of the victim? We don't know.
Well, that was brought to my attention late
That the Prime Minister goes out and does something like this, where he chucks out a complaint, details of it, names the employer in a building like this, weaponises it as a defensive strategy to make up for his own failings. That's what just happened out there. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and no wonder women are so angry.
But the Morrison government has had a pretty poor track record on issues affecting women that really predates all the toxic behaviour uncovered in Parliament House more recently. I recall one time, for example, the Prime Minister was asked about women giving birth on the side of the road because one town had no birth facilities at the hospital.
As a result, a number of women have been forced to give birth on the side of the Barton Highway. Does the Prime Minister agree that that is unacceptable?
And the Prime Minister responded by bragging about how women would benefit from a highway upgrade.
That's why we've committed $150 million to upgrade the Barton Highway, which includes...
But today we are here to help. Women, that is. Though if Scott Morrison listens to us, it could help him too, I'm sure. So when it comes to addressing the systemic issues which are impacting Australian women's everyday lives, it often feels like the problems are big and sometimes impossible to tackle. However, tackling any big problem is easiest when you do it piece by piece. So today I'll be talking to the Australia Institute's research economist, Eliza Littleton, about 8 things that the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, can do right now if he wants to show he's serious about some of the issues that impact women the most. Picture issues for dealing with the toxic culture a little later. G'day, Eliza. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Eb. Thanks for having me on the show.
So you helped put together this list of 8 things that the Prime Minister could be doing, and you're an economist, so we're going to start with some of these big economic impacts that could really make life a lot better for Australian women. So let's start with one of the kind of biggest and most egregious policy failures, and that's the big gap in superannuation for women. Tell me about that gap and what we could do to fix it.
Well, it is a really big gap, as you say, and it's particularly big in Australia. On average, women retire with 28% less superannuation than men, and this is across all age groups. So as much as this gap might be reducing a little bit across age groups, it's still quite high. And at retirement age, nearly 1 in 4 women, so 23%, have no superannuation.
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever. And this is compared to 13% of men who retire and have no superannuation. So it's a big difference. This creates lots of problems for women when they retire, and they're disproportionately experiencing poverty, particularly around housing, and because we all know that the age pension is inadequate.
Yeah. We know that the fastest growing cohort of homeless people are women over the age of 55. We know that single women in retirement are more likely to live in poverty than men. But don't worry, if you need to escape a domestic violent relationship, you can draw down on your retirement savings in order to do so. It defies belief that not only should women who are protesting be glad they're not getting shot, they should also have to go into poverty to escape violence.
And so what are some of the things that the Prime Minister could do to help address that gap? Because I think we'll get into a little bit later what are the causes of that, which is the gender pay gap, which obviously ends up magnifying in retirement. But what are some of the other ways that superannuation is set up to benefit men?
It is a systemic issue, and these issues that we're going to talk about today are quite interconnected, and it means that, addressing there is kind of no one policy solution to addressing these problems, and what we do need is kind of a suite that tackle kind of the different dimensions of the economic issues that women experience. But a really good place to start would be to abolish the $450 per month minimum threshold on superannuation, which means that anybody earning below that a month doesn't actually have to make any superannuation contributions, which means that, this results basically in people who earn less over their lifetime retiring with a smaller nest egg.
And so that would be women because, as we've spoken with Alison Pennington about previously, women are more likely to be in kind of temporary, less secure, less well-paid jobs. So they might not be meeting that $450 threshold for the superannuation. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So women are definitely overrepresented in low-wage jobs. They actually, and I think Alison quoted this, she said that 45% of women in Australia are actually employed in part-time jobs. So as a result, they're definitely overrepresented in the group of people who fall under that threshold.
We earn 13.4% of what men earn. Our jobs are often casual, part-time, insecure, never knowing when you're going to get the next shift, the next pay package. And this government cannot claim ignorance of this.
Another really great thing that the government could do is actually devise a strategy to compensate people who do unpaid labour in our economy and who contribute incredible amounts of domestic and care work in our households.
Which we know is disproportionately women. And that's a good one to bring up because that's something that pushed a lot of women out of the workforce during the pandemic when, for example, there were greater caring responsibilities, less access, at least for a certain time, to childcare and school, all of those kinds of things. So, that's another really great suggestion. But tell me specifically about superannuation tax concessions, because I know the Australian Institute has done a bunch of work on this and it's really drilled into my brain that they overwhelmingly benefit men compared to women.
Yeah, tax concessions on superannuation absolutely benefit men more than they benefit women. So at the moment, contributions and earnings to superannuation are taxed at a concessional rate. So most people pay 15%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a flat tax compared to income tax, which is taxed progressively at people.
So the more you earn, the more proportionally you pay in tax.
Exactly. The marginal tax rate is quite different. So basically, when we're talking about a tax concession on super, we're talking about how much money people are keeping in their pockets as a result of funneling money into superannuation and avoiding progressive income tax.
So you could be earning a whole bunch of money and contributing a huge amount of that into your superannuation to help you in retirement, but you'll be paying far less tax if you're a high income earner on your super when it goes in than you would be if it was just money you were earning in income.
Exactly. And it adds up because these tax concessions actually cost the government $41 billion per year.
So it's a big cost to the budget, $41 billion. That's a lot of money.
Compared to, for example, the age pension, which costs $48 billion. So it's very similar. And for example, education, we spend $39.9 billion on education in the last budget, for example.
Yeah. So it's a huge outlay.
Yeah. We're spending less on education than we are lining the pockets of people who earn a lot of money.
Right. And so because men are more likely to earn higher incomes, they have a greater ability to contribute into superannuation, and then they get greater benefit from paying less tax once they're putting it in.
Absolutely. So 60% of superannuation tax concessions actually go to the top 20% of households in Australia. And we know that women earn less than men. And so the largest proportion of that 20% are actually men.
So thinking then about the causes of why we end up with such a huge gap between the outcomes for women and men by the time they get to retirement, obviously one of the key things there is the gender pay gap. Now, I've already touched a little bit on the fact that women are more likely to be in insecure work, in part-time work. That work tends to be undervalued and they get paid less than men. Tell me about the gender pay gap.
So the gender pay gap is calculated based on ABS statistics, and it's an average of full-time weekly earnings. So it's only full-time jobs that get considered in the kind of often cited gender pay gap of 13.4%. But as Alison mentioned in the last podcast, the economist at the Centre for Future Work, she calculated the true gender gap to be probably closer to 31%. So that's including all different types of jobs, not just full-time jobs. And as I mentioned before, more than almost half of women are actually employed in part-time jobs. So they're not even considered in this statistic.
So it's a much more accurate measurement of the gender pay gap. And then over a lifetime of getting paid less, obviously you end up with less in super, you're getting less benefit from those tax concessions we've just discussed. But it all kind of starts with that pay gap to begin with. And obviously that's not just in specific areas. The pay gap's really across a range of industries and different professions, and it's all over the place. It's quite complex to solve. What is one way that, or some of the ways that we could start to address that gender pay gap?
Yeah, one of the best and most effective policies that the government could implement right now is to reintroduce free public childcare, which they did for 3 months last year. So we know it's possible. The costs of childcare represent a really critical barrier to paid opportunities for women. And actually, over half of women with young children not participating in the paid workforce have identified childcare costs as being a key factor in the decision not to work.
Because it's amongst the highest cost in the OECD for childcare, isn't it?
Exactly, because so much of it is privatised.
I don't want a parent to have to choose between feeding their kids and having their kids looked after, or having their education being provided. This virus is going to take enough from Australians without putting Australian parents in that position of having to choose between the economic well-being of their family and the care and support and education of their children. I won't cop a situation where a parent is put in that place with their kids.
So free childcare, and we know that the government can do it because they did it. They did it in the middle of the pandemic and then just kind of stopped it.
Absolutely. And it would actually act as incredible economic stimulus. In fact, if Australia had the same female participation rate as the Nordic countries, then we would probably see around 380,000 additional women in the workforce, which has an incredible growth impact on our GDP, if that's the way we want to measure progress. And This is actually worth a lot of money, right, to GDP. It's actually worth around $48 billion per year to our GDP, which is about 2%.
Yeah. So it's not small, shall we say.
We're talking about a policy that pays for itself.
Yeah.
An effective policy.
And so talk to me about a national employment strategy for women, because it's obvious to me that we have one for men. We've got the government's Home Builder program to boost the construction industry. We've got a big program for infrastructure projects, which again, mainly benefit men. We've got a gas-fired recovery, supposedly. It's all targeting jobs, not only in employment unintensive industries like the gas industry, but industries that we know primarily employ men, while we know it was women that really lost out, really the earliest and hardest hit in the pandemic. So how would a national employment strategy for women help, and why do we need one?
Well, we need one because, as it's become clear over this conversation even, these issues are quite complicated and they're interconnected, and it means that there is no kind of one policy solution that will have vast rippling effects throughout all women's lives and their capacity to be economically independent and to participate in the economy and in paid work, but also receive benefits from their unpaid labour as well. We need a suite of policies, which is why I think that we need a national employment strategy for women to address these kind of wicked problems.
Yeah. Speaking there of unpaid labour, women actually do quite a bit of the paid caring labour as well. And I'm thinking now of education, aged care, healthcare. We know those are big employers for women. One of your ideas was to increase public funding for schools and for healthcare. Why would that specifically help women?
Well, as you mentioned, women are overrepresented in teaching jobs, in education jobs, and in healthcare jobs. So if we could basically better resource these industries and channel funding into increasing wages in these industries, this would directly put money in the pockets of women. This would be such a direct way to improve women's lives and their employed lives.
So I hear the government say a lot that they want to foster wage growth, but they could really just step in and increase wages for women.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
it seems like a more straightforward way to do it.
It does. Instead of channeling money through business, who we rely on the benevolence of to have that money then trickle down into our pockets.
Yeah. And I guess that brings us back to something that I've previously discussed with, I think, Matt Grudnoff and Richard Dennis, which is, again, coming back to those idea that those industries are actually quite employment intensive. Per $1 million that you invest in them, they employ quite a lot of people. So not only will it be good for women, it'd be good for the whole economy.
Absolutely, yes. They're more labour intensive than they are capital intensive, which means this money will be going into wages instead of investment and purchasing machinery.
So I want to move now into some of the areas that address the toxic culture that we seem to be dealing with at the moment. Now, any women listening to this will be quite familiar with all the things that we do to keep ourselves safe. I think we've all probably pretended to be on a phone call while walking home or had our keys between our fingers. And I know the Australia Institute has done some research several years ago that showed that 9 in 10 women have experienced verbal or physical street harassment from strangers. And we're seeing up on Parliament, which is not too far from where we're recording this, obviously all the horrendous allegations of rape, of a toxic culture. More stuff came out on the news yesterday that I don't even want to talk about because it's so gross. And the government doesn't seem to be dealing with this particularly well.
The young fellow concerned, he was a really good worker and he loved the place, and I feel bad for him about this. But
she said, what? How about feeling bad for the cleaners who had to come in and clean after that disgusting mess? How about feeling bad for the female MP whose desk was disrespected?
I've had a gutful. I have had an absolute gutful of poor behaviour towards women, and my conscience will no longer allow me to remain quiet.
but you've got some ideas here for some specific things where they could start that might make a good start. So tell me about a nationally consistent framework around sexual assault.
So this was actually a suggestion from Grace Tame, the 2021 Australian of the Year, and she called on the government to adopt a nationally consistent framework to support and protect survivors of sexual assault.
Number 3, how we provide a consistent national framework that supports survivors and their loved ones, not just in their recovery, but also to disempower and deter predators from action. So what is it that we must do? First and foremost, let's keep talking about it. It's that simple.
And one of the things she drew attention to was the fact that each state in Australia has a different definition of consent, which creates a lot of ambiguity and inconsistency, and it undermines our capacity to teach what consent is to children, the next generation, to have these conversations.
And so the same as we used to have very wildly different laws regarding abortion, I guess, but I think there is a lot of pushes at the state level, for example, to adopt an idea of enthusiastic consent, that it can't just be, oh, well, she didn't say no, but what made you think that she was saying yes and consenting affirmatively? But Grace Tame is more or less saying that because it's so radically different from state to state, it makes it difficult for people to complain and then for those complaints to get up. Is that the idea?
Absolutely. And this seems like a much more down-to-earth suggestion than a consent app, which was suggested in Parliament.
Yeah, although I think the police commissioner dumped that one pretty quick.
Yeah.
But obviously it's so important because this affects so many people.
Yeah, and absolutely. And basically at the moment we have a system which disincentivizes reporting sexual assault and sexual harassment and doesn't really disincentivize committing sexual assault and sexual harassment. The Australia Institute of Health and Welfare did a survey and found that 200,000 people were allegedly sexually assaulted in the space of a year. Police were only notified of 23,000 of these cases, and only 5,000 people were convicted out of these cases. So really, where is the incentive to report sexual harassment and sexual assault?
Yeah, where's the justice? So there's two final things that we're going to talk about, and they're a little bit connected. But one is the independent member for Warringah, Zali Steggall. She's got some amendments proposed to the Sex Discrimination Act.
So many women and men around Australia are saying enough is enough today and are marching for justice. It is baffling that these amendments have not already been implemented, and even more so that the government did not take up my invitation some weeks ago to present it themselves.
Just tell me quickly, what is it that she's proposing?
She introduced a private member bill that introduces amendments to the Sexual Discrimination Act that would make sexual harassment illegal in all circumstances. Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, it seems like it should already be the case. But actually, this is addressing a loophole where members of Parliament are not actually liable for sexual harassment in their workplaces under the Act.
So they're not currently covered by the Act. That's a loophole.
It's a loophole.
For Parliament.
Yes. And as we've seen recently, cases of sexual assault and harassment are incredibly prevalent in Parliament and in all workplaces. In fact, 1 in 3 people in the last 5 years have reported to experience sexual harassment in their workplace.
Yeah, doesn't seem like the type of thing anyone should be exempt from.
No, absolutely not.
And lastly, and this has come up quite a bit in the discussions that we've been having, but the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, did hand down a big report. Has anything happened with that report?
Yeah, she handed it down in January last year, and it was a report on sex discrimination in Australia, in Australian workplaces, and there were 55 recommendations, and only one of them has been actioned by the government so far. That's to establish a workplace sexual harassment council. In fact, Zali Steggall's proposed amendment is one of the recommendations in that report. And yeah, it's extensive. It calls for better funding for community legal services and increasing the power of the Commission to follow up allegations and make sure that employers are doing the right thing.
Yeah, and it even tackles stuff like the use of non-disclosure agreements, and like there's a lot in there, and there's kind of 54 recommendations that they just haven't even touched, and Zali Steggall's picked up one of them as well, doing their jobs for them. We might leave it there, Eliza. That seems pretty comprehensive to me. Certainly a good place for the Prime Minister to start with one of these 8 recommendations. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 23rd of March, 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and Eliza Littleton is at Eliza Littleton. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy with help from Grace Golash, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone, particularly all my fellow sisters out there. Stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing those hands, and thanks for listening.